morning, everyone. We welcome you to our Bible study. We are recording from the Plainfield Christian Science Church Independent in Plainfield, New Jersey, the United States of America. And we welcome you, those who have joined us live and those who are listening elsewhere. Today is Saturday, June 17th, 2017. And our moderator for today is Chardell from Pennsylvania. Go ahead, Chardell.
Good morning. First, I'd like to read from Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy, page 566. Quote, "As the children of Israel were guided triumphantly through the Red Sea, the dark ebbing and flowing tides of human fear, as they were led through the wilderness, walking wearily through the great desert of human hopes and anticipating the promised joy, so shall the spiritual idea guide all right desires in their passage from sense to soul, from a material sense of existence to the spiritual, up to the glory prepared for them who love God." End quote.
Thank you. Very appropriate for the topic. Any comments on that?
Perfect.
And it's bringing it home. It's not just Moses and the children of Israel. So shall the spiritual idea guide all right desires in their passage from sense to soul, from a material sense of existence to the spiritual, up to the glory prepared for them who love God. So this story is for us today.
Our journey too, right?
Our journey too, absolutely.
As long as we allow the spiritual ideas to guide us, it'll be a nice journey.
out of the house of bondage.
Shall we
So
do questions?
It's not necessarily an easy journey, though, is it?
No.
No,
But
'cause
it
the
can
devil-
be better than we make it.
Exactly. The devil loves to throw roadblocks in front of us as we journey. The devil doesn't like to see us obeying the spiritual ideas. He would prefer that we obey the mortal beliefs, because it's a threat to the mortal beliefs for us to follow the spiritual ideas. But as we learn, the mortal beliefs are the bondage and the wrong way.
And the topic is obedience.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Number one, question. Where and when in Bible history is Moses sent by God to deliver the Israelites?
Well, it was in Egypt. It was 430 years. Abraham's descendants, the Israelites, had been slaves in Egypt, and God sent Moses to Pharaoh to tell him to let God's people go.
Thank you.
Where was Moses at the time?
He was in the
Midian.
desert, tending the flocks of his father-in-law.
Yeah, his family was not in Egypt, right?
No, it was at the mountain of Horeb.
And why was he not in Egypt at the time?
He had killed an Egyptian soldier, I think it was, or a guard, who was beating up a Hebrew, and he stopped it and killed him in the process, and then realized that somebody had heard people talking, realized that it wasn't just an unknown thing that he had done, and that people did know he had done it, and ran away before the Pharaoh could send people after him to kill him.
Yeah, he fled for his life and stayed out of Egypt for years. Got married, raised a family. So he'd been out of Egypt for a long time.
40 years. How old was he when he started this?
He was 80.
Pardon me?
80.
80. So no excuses. I want to
No
hear about
retirement either.
no retirement, no getting old, no not willing to work for God. No excusing yourself. You're just whatever age. God doesn't know age anyway, so we've got our work to do to keep our shoulder to the plow.
I thought it was also interesting how Moses came to be around the Pharaoh in the first place. His mother, in order to save him from being killed, because the Pharaoh had ordered, boys under 2 to be killed, because he thought that they were going to take over the king's place. And so his mother put him in the basket of rushes, and the Pharaoh's daughter rescued him and raised him as her own.
I think that's a very important point, this beginning. And also it leads into the next question about Moses' obedience to God. What about his mother?
Well, she was able to raise him for the first 12 years.
Well, his Egyptian mother, but what about his Hebrew mother?
No, that's what I mean.
Oh, okay. All right, and how did that come about?
When Pharaoh's daughter found him, I'm not sure if it was a relative that said, "Oh, why don't you have her," meaning Moses' mother, "be a nurse unto him?" And so she did.
That was quite a wonderful turn of events. But originally, think of yourself with this baby. Here you have a Pharaoh going around killing babies. You've got this little child. What did those first few paragraphs say? What did she do? And what did she see in that little boy?
He must have been listening to God.
He was crying. He was weeping. The little baby. Behold, the babe wept.
Okay. Florence, what did you say?
And she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children."
So I'm talking about his real mother.
His real mother. I'm feeling that she must have been listening to God for direction and followed it.
Yeah, this is my point, or a point I'm trying to get to, is her obedience. Her obedience. Her faith in God. That would have been extremely great. To put him in a little basket and let him go up the Nile River like that. And it said when she saw him, that her little child, and of course all mothers feel that way about their children, but said he was a goodly child. So I think she saw something very special in him. And somehow she was able to hide him for 3 months. So we have talked about before the godliness of the mothers of these, what turned out to be great prophets. Now, think about, what if she hadn't done that? Think about how history would have been without Moses. would have been quite different, wouldn't it?
Would have been hugely different.
So it was her obedience to God. And there wasn't much of a Bible then, right? Because Moses was the one who wrote the Bible when he grew up. I mean, the early chapters. So she had this tremendous obedience. And because she obeyed God, look what happened. So my point is, obey God. You never know what it will lead to. I'm sure she had no idea that her son would end up freeing the Israelites. Maybe she had some idea. As I said, she saw a goodly child. But see the good in your children. Bring that good out. Be the godly mother and definitely father. Or aunt, uncle, friend. Linda, tell the story now. I want you to tell that story you told me yesterday about the little boy that you saw.
Oh, on the train. I was actually in a subway in the city attending my son's graduation, and I don't do well in crowds, but I was using some of my new tools that I had learned from playing with field, which is radiating instead of absorbing. And on the subway, I couldn't really see this child, but he was with his mother, a little African-American little boy, and they didn't look well off. And he couldn't see me, and I couldn't see him. I could just see the tip of his head. But I decided to turn that around and think differently about it. And we need such prayer for race relations in our inner cities. So I just decided instead to bless him and bless that he could not be mesmerized by his surroundings, that he could be raised up and he could do good and express God's intelligence. And I don't remember. Actually, the thoughts just kind of flowed through me. They weren't anything I conjured up. But I just kept blessing his little head that he could, these people could be raised up in these cities that come and turn things around. And so when our stop got there, I stood up, and he immediately got eye contact with me and started squealing and smiling and chattering. He was very young. And he followed me off the whole way on the subway, just talking and chattering and laughing and smiling. And I just thought it was really fascinating. It's very humbling how mental this world is, and just the beauty of that interchange. And it was very touching for me to see the importance of blessing everyone around us.
How receptive the little children are.
Yes, absolutely.
But without saying a word, without even seeing.
And never eye contact or anything. He didn't even know I was over there, but he knew who I was as soon as I stood up. I mean, he wasn't talking or smiling or laughing at anybody until I stood up. And it was not me personally. I just know it was the God working through.
That is the power of the Christ that you express. And so, wherever you are, wherever you're traveling, wherever you're going, you remember this story. In the car, you bless others. We've mentioned it before. If you can't speak to them, you bless them mentally. That thought that Linda expressed, that Christly thought, that could change that little boy's life from perhaps one in poverty or whatever else to one of who knows what could happen. He felt her Christly thought blessing him. We're all mental. Now, on the other hand, if you look at someone and think disparagingly of them, they feel that too. But this is how we bring these thoughts home. This is obedience that Linda expressed, and that we all should be doing. I've never particularly liked crowds or traveling in subways and things, but that's exactly what I do when I have to do it. I'm praying and radiating. It's the only way I can do it.
Really, it's amazing what peace you feel if you do that, even in crowds. I've done this when I went home once. The city of so much noise going on, but I just used a little truth that I had learned at that time, and it changed the whole thing. I was feeling so peaceful, I could notice only the good things. It's amazing.
It
I will
is
second
amazing.
that because I do not like to ride in crowds, and this is the first time I've ever been peaceful through a crowded city.
And bless that little boy, you never know how much or in what ways she planted seeds that day. So this is what we do. This is why. This is what radiating is. And this mother who protected that little boy, Moses, and ended up tremendous good came out of that. Boy, did it ever. Yes, and thank you. I guess maybe that was Elizabeth. She raised the child for 12 years, which what a blessing she got to be with him. And that's how Moses knew Aaron, and Miriam. Who were they?
His brother and sister.
Mother and sister. So they weren't separated. It was a wonderful working out. And it goes along with the rest of this story on obedience, because it certainly started with that godly mother of Moses. We can ask ourselves, would we have had the courage to do that? Put your little baby in a basket and send him up the Nile River? Goodness. Anyway, thank goodness she did.
I think if we already have a relationship with God, which we must have, then we would have the courage too when he says to do something.
Well, that's right. She was living it moment by moment. And so she did have that courage. It was there for her. And also she was guided by God. There wasn't any sense of, well, she was thinking about it, or should she or shouldn't she. She felt it was God directing her, and so she did it with great peace, and the result was amazing. And what a strange thing to do, really. Sometimes you're asked to do strange things. You don't second guess it when it comes from God. You do it, and you'll find the blessings are manifold. Mrs. Eddy says you have to obey before you understand. You don't wait. You don't say, you don't get the message, okay, well, if I do this, then the Pharaoh's daughter will find him, and you'll be asked to take care of the child for 12 years. No, that's not how it works. You gotta just do it and trust. So, okay, I don't know if anyone else on that one. But.
Yes, Jesus.
Go ahead. Is that Mike or?
Yes. Jesus actually spoke on that when he talked about what was going to happen with the destruction of Jerusalem. He said that the mother wouldn't know whether to take the child or leave the child. And he didn't say it in a condemning sort of a way. He just stated it, that the times would be so turbulent. So speaking of Moses' mother's courage, again, it was a situation where things didn't work out. She put herself at risk, but she never occurred to her. I mean, her whole duty was to follow God's guidance and let it work out as it should.
Thank you very much. So, whether you are a parent or not, what Linda did, anyone could have done. But it's the obedience to God that blesses the little children.
And the big children.
And the big children. Everywhere you go, you should be a blessing, radiating. People will feel it. That little child certainly did. He was receptive to it. It's a beautiful story. Thank you. Okay.
How we doing, Charlie?
Fine. I was wondering if anybody wanted to mention Moses was so obedient to God for so many years. There's a whole long list that we'll never be able to talk about in this hour. But there are, and I just wondered if anybody found a few things that touched them in his obedience.
Right, there's a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, he he left this very comfortable, safe place where his family was, and left all that and went back to Egypt to confront the Pharaoh.
That was after the burning bush experience. Still, it took tremendous courage. What did he say at the burning bush experience? Was he just eager to do this?
He was sure he wasn't the guy.
Who am I?
Which, in a way, is saying definitely he was the guy. Because he
Exactly.
didn't think too highly of himself in a personal sense. That made him
Eminently qualified.
eminently qualified.
Right.
Recently, someone was asked to write a lesson. And she
Who had
told
never ever written a lesson
Yes,
before.
and she told me just before it happened, she'd gotten the thought she could never write a lesson. and that made her very well qualified for the job, because it's true.
She knows she can't.
She knows she can't. She knows God has to do it. And that's probably why she got asked to do it. Anyway, and of course, I had no idea that she'd been thinking she could never do it, but I was aware of humility and obedience to God. That I was aware of, and those are the qualities we look for. So,
Obviously, Moses was listening all the time. I just get this picture of them fleeing from Egypt and then standing before the Red Sea. And where do we go now? It just said that Moses was just there. He obviously communing with God, got the message to step forward. Now, who could have said something like that unless they were totally trusting the one that was guiding the entire event? Because keep in mind that at the time they took the first step, the Red Sea had not yet parted. So who's going to say, step forward at that point in time with this sea right there in front of you? Unless it was God Almighty who was directing it and Moses who was listening to the divine commands. How was Moses obedient? He was listening.
that was a huge example of his obedience. Also, going the way through the desert, they couldn't get to the promised land going through the enemy territory, so first they had to go through a desert. And we've read the story how God did take care of the children of Israel, feed them, provide water, and with the Red Sea.
And he obeyed God. God directed him through the desert, directed him through places where nobody would ever want to go. But even before then, when God was preparing him for this mission, he'll throw his rod on the ground, it became a snake, and he said, now pick up the darn snake. It took courage.
By the tail yet, of all places.
Right.
You don't pick up snakes by the tail, typically.
I wanted to mention that. Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I wanted to mention that before, he got the word to lead the children of Israel, he spent 40 years working as a shepherd. And he had to, learn patience and trust through doing that day after day with the sheep. And it's interesting, in Numbers it says, now the man Moses was very meek above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. So he had that, he was prepared.
You're absolutely right. It's a very important point. He was prepared. 40 years, okay? Yeah. It wasn't 2 or 3, it was 40. So all of this, how long, oh Lord? Forget it. And that is tending that sheep. Those sheep, you learn many, many lessons, as did David, the shepherd boy. Also, you have a lot of time out there under the stars to think about things, think about God and creation, I'm sure. Get a close relationship with God. I'm sure he repented for killing that man. But he was being prepared. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Tending those sheep was probably pretty much exactly like tending the Israelites through the desert too.
Well, it was. That's right. The patience, the caring, the going after the straying ones. I want to mention one thing that I saw when I was reading Wikipedia. Wikipedia's last sentence was this: scholarly consensus sees Moses as a legendary figure and not a historical person. I was so offended by that. We are debunking that. All right?
How they can explain their Exodus.
How can they explain anything? This is the intellectual mind, scholarly consensus. You can just see them all. So their material interpretation of things, which is useless. But I've been asking Jeremy to correct these things with scholarly. This was a different one. I asked him to correct something else, but scholarly consensus means they are all, I won't say the words, but the letters begin with AH. We have no respect for, and if anyone's listening who is a scholarly consensus person, well, you better get with the program, because Moses lived and moved and breathed and had his being in God. So I just wanted to clear that air.
And God is no respecter of persons. Certainly no respecter of scholarly consensus.
Yes. So, okay. Florence, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say that the 40 years and what David also did, it's like the preparatory periods in our lives. And I look at our own lives. If we look at our own lives, it seems as though the journey you've made up till probably now is like, all the things that I learned makes an impact on what I'm doing now. It's amazing. So, when you're going through the difficulties and so on, less memorying, no memorying. You just learn. It's a learning period, really.
It is. It is. And you think you'll never get through it, nothing will ever change, but that's just not true.
And that's why we have a lesson entitled Probation After Death, isn't it? Because the learning process keeps going. It's not like it ever ends. I mean, isn't that exciting?
But whatever qualities you're developing, God is leading it to something.
Yeah.
No, that was true for me. For years and years, I was learning stuff. I didn't know why I was learning. It had nothing to do with the jobs I was doing. I just felt I had to learn it. When I came here, I was like, oh, this is why. Okay.
Is that something? That's true for me, too. Years and years and years of washing bathroom floors and other things. Years and years of it. I said, well, where is this going? So
it's true of all of us.
Yes.
We all have been brought here from various places, from various backgrounds, from various experiences, for a very specific reason. And only God knows.
You have been sent, Carthens wrote about on the forum a few months ago. No coincidence. And what sends you is your desire to know more of God, your receptivity. Then He uses you for His purposes.
It may take between 80 and 120 years to figure out why that is.
That's it. So, but we go on for eternity, so that's just a flash in the pan. So what else? What else has Moses been so obedient? He was so obedient. It was just... Darty, did you have any more examples?
Well, I started to read. I read about the tabernacle. This is where the ark was handled and built. It's just amazing. He followed everything to the smallest detail, and there were a lot of details. It was just amazing to me.
Good example, huh?
Yes.
And, you know, the fact that he was willing to leave. Here he had all the comforts. He was a Egyptian prince. All those comforts. He was willing to leave all that. That in itself is amazing. And throw himself into this position where he was anything but protected and taken care of or treated princely. But what wonderful characteristics he had to do that. Faithfulness, but love of God, and for his brother, his brethren, were the children of Israel. Quite a story. And believe me, I have no doubt it's true. Anyone else on that question? Did he get into the promised land?
No. No, he did. Moses died, but he had Aaron take over.
Spiritual promised land, I'm sure he did.
Joshua. Over.
Caleb.
Oh. But what he did was tremendous. Absolutely tremendous. It started with that mother who listened. So never question or doubt. There's a little book that Bob sent me called The Butterfly Effect. It doesn't mention God, but the point of it being is you do one little thing that you might not think is that important, and that little thing blesses someone else, which blesses someone else, which blesses someone else, and you can end up tremendous things happening from your one little thing that you did. You know it's true. You can ask yourself how you came here, how you got here. It was something.
Series of little kindnesses or little whatever.
There's a beautiful poem we've had in our Liberator, and it's called Pass It Down, I think, and talks about, you get a smile, you pass that smile on. It goes down through the ages. Any truth is eternal, and it will have an effect. What is so sad is when people withhold that truth, when they don't give the loving thoughts that Linda gave on the train. She could have just been sitting there, worried and thinking about herself, but instead she was in the blessing business, as we all are in that blessing business. So don't be so selfish that you don't hear what God is bidding you to do, because He's always speaking to you. And then, if you are selfish, then wonder why you're so miserable. Well, there's a reason for that, because you've been selfish. Stop it.
That's kind of a good lead into the next question, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Question 3. How were the Israelites disobedient?
They were constantly complaining.
I thought it was interesting that in the same chapter, after they had crossed the Red Sea and they gave a song of thanksgiving to God for getting them away from the Egyptians and destroying the Egyptians, same chapter, they started murmuring about the water. And I thought, wow, that didn't take long. And then and one of the people on the forum mentioned about, how often do each of us, and myself included, start murmuring right away after something good's happened.
Yeah, I like that. I think that was Elizabeth. That part read all of it. Elizabeth, Jeremy, and then there was someone new named Ray who wrote on that topic. Does anyone have an iPad that can bring that up? What, Elizabeth? Do you, Elizabeth, have it? You wrote about murmuring.
Yeah, I do. Let's see, where is it? Okay. Yeah, I just said a murmur from the Webster's 1828 dictionary. It means to grumble, to complain, to utter complaints in a low, half-articulate voice, to utter sullen discontent. I was struck by how many times the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against God. They complained about the bitter water, then about lack of food, and then about lack of water. And yet every time their need was met, they still murmured. They had been miraculously delivered at the Red Sea. The bitter water became sweet. God provided manna, and again water flowed from the rock. So you'd think after a while they would stop their murmuring. It got me thinking, how much do I murmur or complain during the day? It's a negative state and easy to fall into. It is denying God's love and care. The antidote is constant gratitude for the good already at hand.
I was reading just, I think it was yesterday, Mrs. Eddy saying, well, remember the Daniel's prayer, how often Mrs. Eddy prayed, and that she was telling us to pray at least twice a day, and in that prayer to give thanks, to remember your blessing. Of course, we have our Wednesday evening meeting. This is why, lest we forget, from Rudyard Kipling, and it's in Miscellany, I think Mrs. Eddy quotes it, to forget your blessing. I was reading our November 2015 Love is a Liberator. The topic was gratitude. It's one to reread. It's wonderful. Gratitude is essential to your well-being, to your health, to your happiness. Start grumbling under your breath, think no one can hear it. Well, you can hear it, and you're mesmerizing yourself in the wrong direction. And then what did you say, Jeremy?
Oh, well, it was just proof that they took a personal view of Moses being the only man that God could work through, because they kept looking to him for all this stuff. And was mentioned that it was 430 years that they were in slavery, and I think that's why it took so long to raise somebody up, and why that person had to be taken out of their culture, for the beginning of his life, to get away from that culture of complaining. That must have been what kept them there. I'm sure anybody, somebody else could have done it before that. It's a long time to be in slavery.
A lot of generations.
Thank you. I loved where you said where they entertain devils unaware. So be careful that you're not entertaining devils unaware. Instead of angels, you're entertaining devils. When you're mumbling under your breath and complaining, you are. What is Jim always likes to quote the hymn? Complaint is what? Poverty. So think about that one. You're in poverty, maybe it's because you're complaining and not thanking God for the good that's already been given to you, seeing it and acknowledging it. Only then will you be able to receive more. And Jeremy brings out an interesting point. And Spurgeon, one of Spurgeon's sermons, spoke to it. They had been under Egypt's rule for 430 years. So what was happening to them? Well, before that bad Pharaoh came up, they were getting used to being in Egypt. They were assimilating. They were becoming Egyptians, which is a form of disobedience. Now, not all of them, I'm sure, but evidently a majority of them.
That's why they probably, when they complained, they started saying we'd be better off if we'd never left Egypt.
That's right. They had assimilated. Who originally brought them into Egypt? What prophet?
Joseph.
Thank
Joseph.
you. Joseph.
Brought his family down because they had corn, because Joseph got the message, 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. So when the famine came, he saved his family.
Jacob and his brothers,
Yeah,
father Jacob.
and all of their family.
And how was Joseph respected in Egypt?
Yes, very much so.
Yes, he was. So they started out, Joseph and his family, and I guess there were around 70 of them. There was a big family, well respected. And of course, then they grew and they grew and they grew, didn't they? They multiplied quite a bit. But according to Spurgeon, he says that they got into this Egyptian way of life. They started worshiping the Egyptian gods. They began to forget who and what they were after 430 years. But then Pharaoh enters. And what was his beef, so to speak?
Was he afraid about the numbers?
Yes, he was afraid about the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
He began the oppression, killing the children. If you've ever seen the movie Ten Commandments, you'll see how awful it was. Anyway, it was quite awful. And that is when they began to what? The children of Israel. Not yet. Well, they were complaining, definitely. They were complaining bitterly, but they began to do something else, which all happens when we get broken, the Christians say. They cried out to God, didn't they? Cried out to God. They asked God for help. Up until then, I don't think they had they? Was there any record they were asking for God's help while they were enjoying their Egyptian life?
Even though they were enslaved.
Yeah, they were in
I mean, you
bondage.
can imagine all of the jealous attitudes among real Egyptians toward these strangers, these foreigners.
But it wasn't until things got so bad they began to cry out to God. Now, does that ring a bell with anyone?
Definitely.
Also sounds like there's another lesson here. They went into slavery. Maybe at the time it may have been somewhat tolerable. It's the way all evil works. It takes to take a little step to see if it'll go unopposed, and then a bigger step, and then so something gets to be where it's so extreme, it requires an immediate resolution.
That's it. Things have to get so bad.
I want to say, one reason that they started forgetting God was that they settled in the land of Goshen, which was a very fertile area. So it was a good place to live in the whole region. So life was probably easier and better. And then that's when they started forgetting God, because they had all they sort of needed,
Yeah. I know they always talk about the Nile River and how fertile the area around the Nile was, and everything would just grow. It was so abundant. I don't know, my mother, who's Southern, she used to say that about the South, that crops would grow and living was easy. It wasn't until something would jar people to wake them up that they needed God. Sometimes that happens. Go to sleep. Things are true.
Didn't I say something about, didn't we talk about this at the Boston Church, where Mary Baker Eddy said that was asked what would happen after she passed away, and said that the church would degenerate into material prosperity.
Exactly right.
Correct.
Which is what has happened. That's why when good things happen, you have to thank God all the more, and you use whatever good has happened for His purposes to bless others. That is why selfishness is forbidden.
So doesn't it say a tough thing about life that when you do have material things, it's easy to forget God?
Absolutely.
Yes, that is the danger.
I mean, it's just, difficult for anybody, is what I'm saying, But we all have to watch out for it.
Exactly.
Individually and as a nation, the materiality puts people to sleep. And they can get taken over by wrong thoughts, wrong suggestions.
But it also leads to conflict eventually.
Eventually it does.
I think there's a big point here, too, because not only did Joseph save his family, but he also saved Egypt. And that's where full demonstration would have been that they should have converted, the Egyptians should have converted to to Joseph's God, to our God. And that would have been the solution, but by having the Egyptians continue in their separation, worshiping the many gods, then they eventually became jealous and oppressed the Hebrews instead of listening to their God and following the correct course.
That's a very good point, Mike. That is excellent. Absolutely right. That would have changed everything. You'd had the Egyptians converting to believing the one God and worshiping the one God instead the other way around. You must remember that in our nation now.
It goes back to what Jeremy said about worshiping or entertaining the devil unawares.
Yeah. That's a very important point. Thank you for that.
Pharaoh finally accepted much too late, wasn't it?
Pharaoh? Yeah. Pharaoh refused to listen. It's called hardening of heart. Another lesson. You refuse obedience to God. See what happens when you do obey God. If you don't, your heart hardens. You get deeper and deeper and deeper into your trouble. It does not end well. Make sure you have a heart that's pliable, that will change, that listens to God, that loves God, that will change direction. Not a hard heart that just refuses. And I know in my past how I've had that feeling. You know, I knew I was supposed to do something, but I'd be damned if I was going to do it. It's a terrible feeling. It comes over you. You know, you can certainly remember, I certainly as a child, when your mother or father wanted you to do something, you did not want to do it. So don't do that too often.
Well, and then what happened when they got to the Promised Land? He sent 12 people over to check it out. Ten of them came back and lied to him.
So they got frightened by giants.
That's the human mind. That's what the human mind sees. I hope you all realize this lesson totally debunks global warming. I don't know how you could read this lesson and still believe in global warming. The human mind will see danger everywhere, and because the human mind has no God, it seeks some material solutions for it when God is the only answer. It means for us that our work is all the more important, because when you have a large amount of people who are believing in something. What does that mean?
It becomes a picture.
Yes, creates a mesmerism that can become a picture.
It can seem to a lot of people to be a law,
And to be real.
and they become firmly convinced about it.
And they begin to see it everywhere.
And by doing so, they actually bring it upon themselves.
I think God wants us to live by by His rule that we don't have to worry about the future. It will take care of itself. God is always in demand, always in command.
Right, but we as Christian scientists need to know it. And Mrs. Eddy talks about the weather, and that every Christian scientist should handle the weather. Everyone. And you're not a Christian scientist until you do. So,
Well, if we were living according to God's laws, we wouldn't do certain things too that are not necessary or, not, will damage anything. That we would take care of what greed will not overcome us in so many directions.
we will not pollute. We will not waste. We will be respectful. And again, this goes back to gratitude. It's a lack of gratitude that isn't that way. So, all combining here. But this is the truth of God's creation, and we must know it. We must be actively knowing it. It's just as Moses changed history, our work here and now will change history. It's not just for ourselves, it's for future generations. It has to be done. And this knowledge and this ability to do it and to obey God and to do the watch, it's got to be work that's handed down. It mustn't cease ever, as it once was when the organization didn't tell anybody that we were supposed to be watching.
I think that working for the weather helps us to see that there are things that aren't bigger than God.
And so many of you mentioned this week, there's one person just saying how much they love this lesson. Shahidat wrote beautiful things on the forum about that, and what an awesome God we have. How awesome, that's what she said, and how true that is. If we're knowing it and being grateful and doing this work and never forgetting our blessings and not murmuring, then all of this secular belief in a godless world will come to naught. Because it's not the truth. It's the Adam dream. It's a aggressive, mesmeric thought. It's not true about God's creation.
Why scholarly consensus is totally useless.
Exactly. It's usually
godless.
godless.
If it's without God, Paul had a good phrase for it.
Gary's favorite.
St. Paul. He had a lot of scholarly consensus in his childhood. And it was all dung.
So they can consense all they want. They can get in their little meeting rooms and consent, but without God, it's not worth anything. And if God didn't say it, it's not being said. So, shall we move on as it's getting close to 11?
Yeah, before before we go on to the next one, I wanted to mention you are teaching us at Plainfield to know our history. They forgot about Joseph all these years later, 400 years. So we must know our history in order to be obedient.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And this Old Testament is our history, and the lessons are rich in them.
Because anybody who doesn't learn from history is destined to repeat the same mistakes. Period. It's really pretty clear, isn't it?
Yes.
Why the Bible is a chart of life. So those who wrote on this topic, I thank you. And this new person, Ray, too, she wrote some very beautiful things. If she's listening, I thank you for it. All worth reading. Our forum is always worth reading and participating in.
I wanted to mention about history, how important it is, this wonderful article that was on the carousel from David Keaston about Mrs. Eddy and her proper place, and never to forget what she stood for in our Christian Science history.
Yes, absolutely right, and that's why we're going over that article, paragraph by paragraph. We're going to raise this up. What was the last quote that you said in your forum about being on someone's shoulders?
Oh, if I have seen a little further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. Isaac Newton.
That's beautiful. So we stand on the shoulders of giants. Keaston, Millie, these people, Liz Knapp, who have given us this information about Mrs. Eddy and the history of our church, Carpenter, certainly. We stand on the shoulders of giants and we pass it on. The true, correct teaching, history. Absolutely. Thank you, Janet. It is essential, because otherwise you will be deceived by the lies unless you know truly what has happened. And so Laura will talk more about it, but Millie book is quoting some passages in the Peel book, and frankly I was appalled. I knew it was bad, but I didn't know it was bad, really bad. So those books deserve to be burned. That is scholarly consensus, godless writing. Godless writing. I don't have any trouble saying that. So, okay.
I bought a book yesterday that is I'm really keen on, called Landmarks for Christian Scientists from Bow to Boston. I don't know if anybody knows this, but it's 174 pages of pictures and maps, about Mary Baker Eddy. Not published by the Boston Church.
Thank you.
Has anybody ever seen the book?
I have. Yeah.
So anyway, I'm not sure what to do with it. I want to make sure they get preserved and, bring to church. So, but it's a great book.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Maybe we can use it elsewhere.
I don't know. Go ahead, Florence.
No, I wasn't saying it.
Go ahead, Shari.
Okay. Shall we look at number 4 quickly, or how do you want to do it? It's 10:57.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. How does this Bible story teach us of God's patience and mercy? And I wanted to add nearness.
Okay. Take them one at a time. God's patience. What does this teach us about God's patience?
He has infinite patience because he's eternal.
He's always there, waiting for us, speaking to us.
Well, in reading this story, isn't it hard sometimes not to feel impatient with these children of Israel, like you want to smack them in the face? Are you going to be murmuring again? And someone should bring up Shahida, what she wrote about consistency in Florence, too, because that deals directly with this. Someone have that on the forum?
I can pull it up. Right, she talked about enduring care of God. Shahida wrote, I clearly missed it before. How awesome is it that God fed the children of Israel for 40 years, never wavering. Somehow I thought it was a one-time affair, but no, every day for 40 years. That's over 14,000 days in a row. Talk about consistency. And then she quoted the Bible, quote, and the children of Israel did eat manna 40 years until they came to a land inhabited, and they did eat manna until they came unto the borders of the land of Canaan, end quote. And then Florence wrote, this consistent care should encourage us that as reflections of God, we possess the ability to be consistent. Being aware of that spiritual fact shuts up the evil whispering that it is so difficult to be consistent.
Thank you. They're very important points, both of them. Well said.
Very well said. And it occurred to me that, there's a divine principle underlying all of this, isn't there? That is the fact that God is divine principle. Divine principle is always in operation. It doesn't turn on and turn off. It's always in operation. It's always governing everything in the universe, including you and me. And when we obey the laws of divine principle, it works for us. When we disobey the laws of divine principle, we have problems. It doesn't matter how long we've been disobedient to the laws, God's law, to the laws that govern the universe. Once we start obeying the laws, we are blessed. And it feels like a patient God to us, but that's kind of a human interpretation of what's going on. What's really going on is that God is divine principle, always taking care of whatever we need all the time, whether we see it or not.
So it's a matter of waking up and seeing it. And how long you wander around in the wilderness is up to you. How long you want to be ungrateful, how long you want to murmur and carry on. They didn't have to wander that long. It's up to you. That principle was operating, ready to lift them up and save them at any moment. And that is true for you at this moment, too. And the thought that comes to you that you can't be consistent, that one day you're going to be grumpy and the next day you'll be radiating, well, that is, again, the initials CS. Excuse me, but sometimes I just can't help it.
The watching point said that.
The watching point, yes. That is, thank you. It's not the truth about you. If you're not consistent, it's because you choose not to be consistent. You choose to complain. You choose to grumble. And you choose to put yourself back in the soup.
Or you refuse to make the changes that God tells you to make.
Yes.
That will put you in a better place because you're just more comfortable with where you've been, in spite of how bad it might be.
Yes, which is, again, an example of the children of Israel.
So underlying all of that is a disobedience, really.
Yes, we're back to disobedience.
And this leads me to this thing that I sent you, Mary, about from Ann Beals about obedience. I'd never seen it like that before. If I may read it, it says that in one of the earlier lectures, it said a friend of mine asked Mrs. Victoria Sargent what was the most outstanding thing Mrs. Eddy ever said to her. She replied, man is his obedience to God. Obedience would be true reflection. So obedience and reflection are synonymous. God has no way to show forth himself except as man. Man is the crowning achievement, the ultimate being, one with God. This is your true status as coexistence. Mrs. Eddy says existence separate from divinity, science explains as impossible. This is from Science and Health, page 522, 10 and 11. God is primary cause and his man effect is always secondary. God being the only source of intelligence is the only thinker, and man, the effect or reflection of God, can only reflect the thoughts of God, of mind, by his obedience to God. Jesus said, the Son can do nothing of himself but what he seeth the Father do. For what things soever he doeth, these also doeth the Son likewise. Thus man is reflection, the pure, perfect manifestation. This is your coexistence. Cause and effect are one. God and man coexist.
Beautiful. Thank you. You could put that on the forum or somewhere. Thank you. Sure. Thank you.
That explains it so well.
Reflection and obedience is synonymous. So, and when you reflect God, you've got it all, honey. There's nothing you lack, and you don't have any reason to murmur. So if you're murmuring, it's because you're disobedient. That's simple. So quite a lesson and quite a Bible study. Thank you very much, Sue. Okay.
And thank you, Shardy.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you, Florence, for wrapping it up
Yes.
so well.
Thank you.
Thank you.